different states in the United States by age group. So in children and adolescents, generally in every state, death rates are getting better. And in the age groups over 55, we see the same. Trying to find answers to those questions. And nobody really had the answer because there wasn't really great data on what made people sick.
Dr. Mary, thank you very much for doing this. Let me ask you, first of all, what is your prognosis about Omicron?
As far as we can understand from Omicron, we think that it's so transmissible that it'll move through the population in Greece and true in each country that it shows up in a pretty short period, from introduction to peak in 4 to 6 weeks. So most of the Omicron wave should happen in the month of January in Greece.
What percentage of the population do you expect to be, to have this variant?
Well, we expect that probably as much as half of the population or more will get infected with Omicron, and that's despite vaccination levels and past infection with other variants of COVID. So a very large fraction of both Greece, but also of the world, should get Omicron.
So is there any sense in trying to control Omicron, really?
Well, what do we know about Omicron? We know that it's very transmissible. It can infect people that have been previously infected. In terms of infection, it can break through in those that are vaccinated or even those that have had a booster. But it is much less severe than past variants, maybe 90 or 95% less severe. So huge numbers coming, but and much less severe, but there still will be pressure on the health system because you take a very big number of infections and a smaller fraction going to hospital. So it's really going to be hard to control infection, but there still will be some consequence on the population.
So you expect hospitalizations to go up?
We expect hospitalizations to go up, nothing like past waves. And from what we've seen in South Africa, now in the United Kingdom and in some of the earlier states in the US, even amongst those that end up in hospital, it's also 80 to 90% less severe. So many fewer are ending up in the ICU, even amongst those that go to hospital. So all encouraging signs about severity, but just the sheer numbers, half of the population getting Omicron means that, that we will probably, or we will see an increase in hospitalizations.
Do you see any kind of strange effects from Omicron, things that you didn't expect, really?
I think when it first emerged in November, there was, and we had no real data about, or compelling data about severity, there was tremendous concern that we would see just sort of this nightmare of mass transmission and then slightly less severe than Delta, and hospitals would be overwhelmed, the death rate would soar. That hasn't happened, fortunately. It's turned out to be much less severe. And to date, we're not really seeing anything particularly unusual, except this fact that 80 to 90% of people who get infected have no symptoms at all. And so that makes a really big difference in terms of impact on the population.
Is this, in a way, the beginning of the end of the pandemic? Because everybody was saying that at some point it will become like a flu, a severe perhaps flu, but a flu. Are we reaching that point now with Omicron?
It's a great question, and I think very hard to answer that in a strictly scientific way. But many people do think that because there'll be so many people infected with Omicron, it'll give a big boost to the immunity level of populations, that it will take a new variant to emerge before we see, after the Omicron wave, more transmission. So it may be the thing that brings us to the point where we go to an endemic stage where, COVID's not going to go away, but we should see it may become that seasonal disease that we've been expecting for quite some time.
But let me get this straight, because the way I understood it, at least, is that these viruses have a linear progress evolution where they become more transmissible but milder. So you expect the next variant to follow that pattern or not necessarily?
You know, it's quite a lot of debate. The people who study the evolution of viruses are saying that there's no particular reason in the case of COVID that the next strain will be milder than Omicron. If you think about flu, from year to year, we get bad flu epidemics and we get milder flu epidemics. So it's not always from year to year that flu is getting milder. And so if you take that analogy, it is possible that we will see a variant in the future that is, transmissible or even more transmissible than Omicron, but could actually be more severe. We just don't know. Now, for the future, as we, have higher levels of vaccination, we have, cumulative exposure to different types of past variants, and the advent of effective antivirals, we do hope that we won't be seeing the big consequences of COVID that we have in the past.
Let me come to the policy conclusions you've reached after your study in Greece. Schools, would you open them or keep them closed?
To the extent that you have teachers that don't need to quarantine because they've tested positive, we think schools should be open. COVID has always been very low risk for children. And more of the concern was them, transmitting back at home to their parents or grandparents. But in a setting where so many people are getting Omicron, that sort of concern probably isn't make any sense because Omicron is going to sort of move through the population anyway. So, and the benefits to children of going to school are very great. So we think schools should stay open.
Masks, should people keep wearing masks?
Again, at the population level, mask wearing probably will not make a huge difference. It'll make a small difference. But for individuals who have comorbidities, who are older, or who are just generally think that they're at greater risk, wearing a mask for the individual makes a lot of sense, particularly a high quality mask, an N95 or a KN95, because it will reduce your individual risk. But in an era where there's so much asymptomatic infection, so you just don't know, and so many people will be out there transmitting, the population level effect of masks is going to be less impressive than what it was for Delta or previous waves.
Should people keep getting their boosters, the third booster, or perhaps even the fourth booster in some cases?
Oh, absolutely. What we know from the evidence is that, vaccines may not be that effective for stopping infection, but they're very effective at stopping severe disease and death. And that having a booster, brings your immunity levels back up to what they were after the first two doses, because over time it starts to wane. So boosters are a very effective strategy for individuals to protect themselves. Again, even more important for those that are older or at risk from comorbidities.
From your vantage point, you have a pretty much global vantage point. Do you see any major differences in the data between Greece and other countries around the world?
No, not yet. Everybody's been worried about is the one group that is at greatest risk from Omicron are those that are not vaccinated and have never been infected in the past, because they have essentially no immunity. And we don't have a lot of data about how bad Omicron can be in that subgroup. But in terms of what we've seen so far, the explosive increase in cases, the much smaller increase in hospitalizations, and no real increase in deaths yet, that's so far been what we've seen in South Africa, in other countries in Europe, and in the States and the United States that have had earlier Omicron waves.
I understand one of the main conclusions you've reached is that there's a need to de-dramatize the situation in some ways. Could you explain to us, what that means and why you think that's important?
Well, I think right now we have been dealing with, for 2 years, with a much more severe infection. And so it made a lot of sense to focus efforts through mask use, through social isolation, on doing everything we can to reduce transmission. But in a setting where transmission is so strong, take the surveys in London that showed on New Year's Day 10% of the entire population of London with an active infection. This is a degree where every day, once you're in the wave, like you are now in Greece, 2 or maybe even 3% of the country is getting infected. So when you're at that level of transmission, and it's much less severe, we need to rethink our approach. We probably can't control infection very much at all. And, if we follow the strategies we've been using of testing and isolation, we will end up with, many critical services in the month of January being hard to sustain because you just won't have the workforce because they're all at home isolating. So we need to sort of rethink our strategies on what we should try to achieve. And in the past, it was, minimize death, minimize hospitalization, stop transmission. Now I think it's minimize death, minimize hospitalization, and stop disruption to essential services. So you would suggest that we don't look so much at the numbers, the actual numbers, and look more at the hospitalization, ICU. I think people have to stop being terrified by the huge case numbers because they will be very large. And they need to look at hospitalizations, or even more importantly, what the Greek government's been doing already, which is looking at those that either are in the ICU or require mechanical ventilation or intubation. That number, which tells us about the critically severely ill with COVID, is the one to watch, because that's telling us, the real consequence. The case numbers will be scary because they will set records, and they'll set records day after day until we hit a peak, which should come probably faster than we thought 2 weeks ago. More likely we'll see a peak in Greece, in the middle of the month. Keep the attention on those severe cases that end up requiring, much more aggressive intervention in hospital. And what's the number that you're looking at the peak in Greece? The actual number of people being infected? I don't have that right in front of me. We are releasing a new model later today. And so we're just trying to take into account the timing, of the surge, because when we put out our first model, Greece hadn't started to have the cases go up. We said they would. But now that we've seen data for Greece and the case surge, which started after Christmas, we are trying to build that into our new release. But what it does suggest, previously we said the peak would be at the end of the month. We now think the peak will be more in the middle of the month. And the last question is, which is kind of a silly question, I know, but when do you think this pandemic will be over? I think personally, and this is sort of going from purely the science to sort of more personal reflection, I think the pandemic, as opposed to COVID, the pandemic will be over once the Omicron wave is over. So probably by the time March rolls around, numbers are down in most places because Omicron will move so quickly. The pandemic will be over, although COVID certainly won't be. And we will just need to change gears and say, look, this is like the flu. It'll be around all the time. We need to keep people vaccinated, boosted over time. And then when we do have a wave of COVID from a new variant or in the winter each year, those people that are older or have some, comorbidity that puts them at greater risk may also want to take further efforts like wearing a mask. And we just need to see that as the new normal. But I think the pandemic, the notion that it requires this societal emergency reaction probably is over come March. Thank you very much, Dr. Mιούρεϊ. It was very insightful. Pleasure to talk to you.